His sunrise over Central Park wasn't a beginning, it was an audit. Pale, unforgiving light filtered through the 12-foot windows of the penthouse, catching the dust motes dancing in the silence. They looked like suspended gold, but I knew better. They were just debris. Dead skin and old fibers floating in the stale air of a marriage that had technically ended 3 days ago, even if the other party hadn't been notified yet. I sat on the edge of the crushed velvet chaise, the fabric cool against my legs, holding a baccarat tumbler filled with ice water and a single slice of lemon. My hand didn't tremble. It was steady, anchored by the weight of generations of composure that ran through my bloodline like iron ore. In the hallway, the sounds of industry were soft but distinct, the friction of a zipper, the snap of a clasp, the rolling hum of wheels on limestone. Julian walked in. He looked perfect. Of course he did. He was wearing the cashmere travel sweater I had bought him in Zurich and the watch my father had given him when he made partner at the firm. He looked like the architect of the year, a title he had bought with charm and maintained with mirrors. "Victoria," he said, his voice a practiced baritone, warm enough to simulate intimacy, but hollow enough to echo. "I hate leaving you with a gala prep, but this Seattle project is bleeding time. The zoning commission is a nightmare." He walked over, blocking the light, casting a long shadow across the Persian rug. He leaned down, his eyes locking onto mine. This was his greatest talent, the calculated glow. He could simulate total engagement, making you feel as though you were the only structure in his skyline. It was impeccable eye contact. It was the gaze of a man who believed his own fiction so thoroughly that the truth had become a liability he simply wrote off. "It's fine," I said. My voice was low, modulated. "Sustainable high-rises don't build themselves." "Exactly," he smiled, relieved by my pliability. "I'll be back Tuesday. We'll do dinner at Le Cuckoo. My treat." He kissed my forehead. The sensory assault was immediate. Sandalwood and expensive dry cleaning, the scent of a man who curates his existence to hide the rot beneath the floorboards. "Travel safe," I whispered, lifting the glass to my lips to avoid saying anything else. He turned, grabbing the handle of his aluminum carry-on. I watched him walk to the heavy oak door. It was solid wood, recovered from a French monastery, designed to keep the world out. He opened it, and for a second, the sounds of the service elevator drifted in. Then, the heavy thud of the latch engaging. Click. The silence rushed back in, instantaneous and suffocating. I didn't move for a long time. I let the ice melt in my glass, watching the condensation weep down the crystal. A lesser woman might have thrown the glass. A lesser woman might have screamed, tearing at the silk drapes or calling his phone to shriek accusations. But hysteria is for people who cannot afford better options. I had resources. I had patience. And now I had the leverage. I stood up, the movement fluid, and walked to the sprawling mahogany coffee table in the center of the room. It was perfectly styled, a testament to the life we were supposed to be living. A sculptural bowl of white orchids, a bronze paperweight, and a stack of Architectural Digest back issues, arranged by spine color. I slid my hand beneath the bottom magazine, the April 2019 issue featuring a Tuscan villa restoration. My fingers brushed the cool, smooth surface of the envelope I had placed there 3 mornings ago. I pulled it out. It wasn't a love letter. It wasn't a hotel receipt or a printed text message. It was something far more damning, because it was bureaucratic. It was a mistake born of arrogance. Julian was brilliant at aesthetics, but he was sloppy with administration. He assumed the mail that came to the terrifyingly expensive P.O. box in the Cayman Islands stayed private. He didn't account for the fact that the primary insurance carrier for our portfolio had automated a redundancy check, merging accounts under the same social security number for a loyalty discount. I opened the envelope, though I had memorized every line of the document inside. Lloyd's of London. Homeowners policy #894 XA. Property, the Azure Shell. Location, Malibu, California. Insured value, $12.5 million. Primary beneficiary, the Julian Vance Living Trust. Secondary beneficiary, Elena Rossetti and minor child. Seattle. He wasn't going to Seattle. He was going to a glass and steel fortress on the Pacific Coast Highway, a property purchased with funds siphoned from my family's charitable foundation under the guise of consulting fees and material acquisition costs. I walked to the foyer, the document heavy in my hand. The morning sun was hitting the marble floor now, illuminating the vein of gray stone that ran from the base of the stairs to the door. I had always admired the pattern, but looking at it now, I saw what it really was. It wasn't a vein. It was a fissure. A structural defect in the stone that had been polished over and sealed, invisible until the light hit it at precisely the right angle. That was our marriage. A beautiful, expensive surface laid over a foundation that had already cracked. He had a second family. He had a second home. And he was funding both with the inheritance my grandfather had extracted from the steel industry in 1950. I took a sip of the watered-down lemon water. It tasted bitter. I walked to the antique secretaire in the corner, unlocked the drawer, and took out a fresh legal pad. I didn't need to call him. I didn't need to confront him. In fact, confrontation would be a strategic error. It would give him time to hide assets, to liquidate the offshore accounts, to spin a narrative where I was the cold, unyielding wife who drove him to it.
No.
I picked up my fountain pen. The ink was black.
Permanent.
I wrote down the first step. Forensic audit of the Vance Foundation, 2020 to present. I wrote down the second step. Quiet title action Malibu. I wrote down the third step. Freezing order via Chancery Division. Julian thought he was the architect. He thought he was the one drawing the lines, defining the space, controlling the flow. He thought I was just the client, the deep pockets, the silent partner living in the house he built. He was wrong. I looked at the insurance policy one last time before sliding it into the shredder. I didn't need the paper anymore. I had the digital scans on an encrypted drive in a safety deposit box 3 blocks away. The machine whirred, eating the evidence of his stupidity with a satisfying grind. I wasn't the client. I was the demolition crew. And I wouldn't swing the wrecking ball until he was standing right in the middle of the room, looking up, thinking he owned the sky. I picked up my phone and dialed the number of the only man in New York more ruthless than my husband. Arthur, I said when the line connected, my voice steady, cool, and utterly devoid of mercy. It's Victoria. I'd like to schedule a meeting. It concerns an immediate restructuring of my assets. And a liquidation. I hung up and looked out the window at the city below. The cars moved like toys. The people were invisible specks. I felt a strange, cold calm settle over me, a stoic rebirth rising from the ashes of the morning. Let him have his weekend in Malibu. Let him play father to a secret child and husband to a woman who didn't know he was paying for her groceries with stolen money. Let him think he had won. Because when he came back on Tuesday, the locks wouldn't be changed. The clothes wouldn't be on the lawn. I would be right here, smiling, handing him a drink, waiting for the exact moment the ground beneath him ceased to exist. Julian's study was a temple to his own intellect, a space curated to intimidate anyone who crossed the threshold. It smelled of aged leather, unlit pipe tobacco, and the sharp, chemical tang of expensive ink. This was where he claimed the real work happened, where he retreated to brood over blueprints and billing hours. He called it his sanctuary. I called it a blind spot. I closed the door behind me. The latch clicked with a heavy, final sound, sealing me inside the silence. I walked to the desk, a slab of reclaimed walnut that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, and looked at the items arranging his life. A Mont-Blanc pen, a compass, a single framed photograph of us on our honeymoon in Como, turned slightly away from his chair, as if he preferred to view it only in his peripheral vision. And there, tucked beneath a stack of schematic drawings for a library he was designing in Boston, was the secondary laptop, the MacBook Air, the travel machine. He hadn't taken it to Seattle. Of course he hadn't. You don't take the evidence to the crime scene. You leave it buried in the foundation. I opened the lid. The screen came to life, the harsh blue light cutting through the dim warmth of the room. It requested a password. Julian was a man of complex aesthetics, but simple arrogance. He believed he was the smartest person in any room, which made him lazy with security. He assumed I wouldn't look, or if I did, that I wouldn't understand the architecture of his deceit. I typed in 6 digits, 101416. October 14th, 2016. The day we stood in the cathedral and promised to forsake all others. The screen unlocked immediately. The irony didn't sting, it clarified. He was using the date of our legal merger to secure the assets of his infidelity. It was a crude, sentimental mistake for a man who prided himself on precision. I didn't waste time on emails or texts. Words can be explained away. They are fluid, subject to interpretation. I wanted the static truth. I navigated to the Photos app. The machine hesitated for a moment, the spinning wheel a brief pause in the execution, before the library loaded. Last updated, 14 minutes ago. The cloud. The digital tether he had forgotten to sever. He was likely in the airport lounge now, scrolling through his phone, unwittingly syncing his secret life directly to the desktop in front of me. I clicked on albums. There it was. A folder titled simply, Our Little Angel. I double-clicked, and the grid filled the screen. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. My breath caught, not in a sob, but in a sharp intake of shock, like plunging into ice water. The first image was of a woman, not a stranger. Elena, his former executive assistant. The one with the soft voice and the efficiency that bordered on prescience. We had let her go 2 years ago because she wanted to pursue personal projects. She was standing in a kitchen. Not just any kitchen, the kitchen of the Azure Shell in Malibu. I recognized the backsplash, the imported Italian tile I had selected from a catalog 3 years ago for a spec property. The California sun was pouring in, washing everything in a golden, hazy light that looked like a Renaissance painting. But it was her silhouette that stopped my heart. She was heavily pregnant. Her hands were cradled under a stomach that was swollen with life, her face turned toward the camera with a look of adoring, bovine contentment. I clicked the next arrow. Elena in the hospital bed holding a newborn. Julian holding the newborn. The baby, a boy, sleeping in a crib that looked like a miniature architectural marvel. Leo. The name was embroidered on a cashmere blanket. I sat back in the walnut chair, the leather creaking under the shift of my weight. The nausea rolled over me, distinct and violent, but I forced it down. I closed my eyes and saw the stark, blinding white of the fertility clinics. I felt the phantom prick of needles in my abdomen, the bruising from the hormone injections, the cold steel of the stirrups. I remembered the humiliation of the waiting rooms, sitting next to Julian while he checked his watch, his impatience vibrating off him like heat. I remembered the sympathetic tilt of the doctor's head when he told us, for the 4th time, that the implantation had failed. Unexplained infertility, they called it a biological deficit. But looking at these photos, the deficit wasn't biological. It was financial. I looked at the screen again. The timestamps on the photos aligned perfectly with his business trips to the West Coast. The date of conception aligned with the week I was in the hospital recovering from the last round of IVF, clutching a hot water bottle and apologizing to him for my failure. He hadn't just cheated. He hadn't just found a younger, warmer body. He had outsourced the one thing I could not provide, and he had done it using my capital. I zoomed in on the background of a photo where Julian was feeding the baby, Leo, a bottle. On the counter behind him sat a stack of paperwork. I recognized the letterhead. It was from the private school in Santa Monica I had donated a library wing to last year. He was building a legacy, a shadow dynasty. He was raising a son in a house bought with my grandfather's steel money, feeding him formula bought with my dividends, and planning a future secured by the trust fund I managed. I felt the tears prick my eyes, hot and stinging, but I refused to let them fall. Crying was a biological response, a release of pressure. I didn't want to release the pressure. I wanted to harness it. I wanted to compress it until it became something harder than diamond, something capable of cutting glass. This was no longer a marriage. It was a hostile takeover. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a high-capacity flash drive. I plugged it into the side of the laptop. My hand was steady now. The shock had sublimated into a cold, crystalline focus. I selected the folder. Export unmodified originals. I dragged the files over. The progress bar moved slowly, a blue line crawling across the screen, carrying the weight of his destruction. I took everything. The metadata, the location tags, the timestamps. Every smile, every sun-drenched moment of their stolen happiness was now being archived into my arsenal. I didn't just want a divorce. A divorce was a negotiation. A divorce meant he would get half of the marital assets, a standard separation of lives.
No.
I wanted an erasure. I wanted to audit his existence down to the cellular level. I wanted to freeze his accounts until he couldn't buy a pack of gum, let alone a flight to Malibu. I wanted to expose him not just as an adulterer, but as a fraud who had plagiarized his entire lifestyle. The transfer completed. I pulled the drive out, the metal cool against my palm. I navigated to the browser history, just to be thorough. Zillow, Seattle. He had opened a few tabs to make it look convincing in case I checked. But the cookies told a different story. Searches for pediatricians in Malibu. California custody laws for unmarried fathers. Transferring assets to irrevocable trusts. He was planning an exit strategy. He thought he was playing the long game. I closed the browser. I wiped the recent items list. I put the laptop back exactly where I found it, aligning the edge with a stack of blueprints precisely to the millimeter. I stood up and smoothed the skirt of my dress. The room still smelled of his tobacco and his pretense, but it didn't intimidate me anymore. It felt like a museum exhibit dedicated to a dead man. I walked out of the study, the flash drive burning a hole in my pocket. I had the insurance policy. I had the photos. I had the timeline. I walked down the hall to the master bedroom, picked up my phone, and sent a text to Arthur, my lawyer. I have the raw materials. We can begin construction. I didn't go to the window to watch the city. Instead, I went to the mirror. I looked at my reflection. Pale, composed, statuesque. The Ice Queen. He had called me once in a moment of frustration. Good. Ice is heavy. Ice preserves. And if you aren't careful, ice breaks the hull of the unsinkable. I turned off the lights. The penthouse plunged into darkness, save for the blinking light of the security system, armed and waiting. I was ready to play the architect now, and my design called for a total demolition. The phone felt heavy in my hand, a black monolith of potential energy waiting to be released. I didn't call the police. I didn't call my mother. I called the number that had been etched into the wainscoting of my life since I was a child, the number you call when the structure of your world is compromised and you need a professional to shore up the foundation or bring the whole thing down. Harrison Sterling. The voice answered on the first ring. Gravel and scotch, worn smooth by 40 years of litigating for the kind of families that own the skylines. It's Victoria, I said. My voice was a flat line. I need you to open the Vanderbilt file. The contingency protocols. There was a pause. Not of confusion, but of calibration. Harrison didn't ask why. He didn't offer platitudes. He simply shifted gears from advisor to executioner. Which level of containment are we talking about, Victoria? Damage control or scorched earth? Liquidation, I said, the word tasting like cold steel. I found the policy, Harrison. And the photos. He has a child in Malibu. He's funding a second life with the capital from the charitable trust. It's embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. The silence on the other end was the sound of a very expensive pen hitting a legal pad. I see. Do you have the documentation? I have everything. Insurance policies, birth certificates, the metadata from his cloud sync. I'm uploading the packet to your encrypted server as we speak. Excellent. What is your timeline? I walked to the window, looking out at the gray, weeping sky. He lands in Los Angeles in 4 hours. He's renting a car at LAX to drive to Malibu. I want his cards to decline at the counter. I want the corporate Amex frozen. I want the joint checking locked for suspicious activity. I want him standing at the Hertz gold counter in his Italian loafers, realizing he doesn't have the credit to rent a Ford Fiesta. Done, Harrison said, the scratching of his pen intensifying. I'll file for an emergency ex parte freezing order on the marital assets immediately. We'll cite the dissipation of funds. The judge owes me a favor. By the time Julian's flight touches the tarmac, he will be financially quadriplegic. And Harrison? Yes. Draft the divorce petition. But don't serve him yet. I want him to sweat. I want him to call the bank and get a busy signal. I want him to call me and go to voicemail. Let him sit in the uncertainty for the weekend. Let him feel the walls closing in before we show him the door. Understood. Where will you be? I'm going to the shore. To the estate. Good. Stay off the grid. Let me be the only voice he hears. I hung up. The transaction was complete. Now came the extraction. I walked into the master closet, a cavern of cedar and recessed lighting that housed a wardrobe worth more than most people's mortgages. I bypassed the racks of evening gowns, the sequined sheaths and silk tools Julian liked to drape me in for galas. He treated me like a mannequin, dressing me in colors that complemented his tie, shoes that elongated my legs but crippled my feet. Those were costumes. They belonged to Mrs. Julian Thorne, the obedient, decorative wife. She didn't exist anymore. I went to the back, to the vintage steamer trunk that had belonged to my grandmother. I opened it and began to pack, selecting only what was authentically mine. I took the cashmere turtlenecks in charcoal and navy. The riding boots I had owned since boarding school, leather-worn soft and impervious to the elements. The Barber jacket that smelled of wet leaves and horses. I moved to the jewelry safe. I ignored the diamond tennis bracelet Julian had given me for our 5th anniversary, an apology in platinum for a week of missed dinners. I left the emerald drop earrings he bought after the second failed IVF cycle. They were beautiful, but they felt heavy, like shackles. Instead, I took the pearls my grandfather had given me on my 21st birthday. I took the signet ring with the Vanderbilt crest. I took the deed to the Southampton property, the original parchment brittle and yellowed, proving the land had been in my name since before Julian was born. I packed with the efficiency of a soldier breaking camp. No sentimentality. No hesitation. Just the rhythmic folding of wool and the clicking of latches. I zipped the leather weekender bag. It was light. My life, stripped of his influence, was surprisingly portable. I walked out of the bedroom without looking back at the unmade bed. I walked through the living room, past the marble fireplace, past the lie of our domestic perfection. I left the keys to the penthouse on the console table, right next to the bowl of dead orchids. The elevator ride down was silent. The doorman, Henry, tipped his cap as I exited. Leaving for the weekend, Mrs. Thorne? I stopped. The wind caught the edge of my coat, whipping it around my legs. The air smelled of rain and exhaust, the scent of the city I was leaving behind. It's Miss Vanderbilt, Henry, I said, my voice cutting through the street noise. Please remember that for the guest list. He blinked, surprised, but his professional mask held. Of course, Miss Vanderbilt. Have a safe drive. My car was waiting in the garage. Not the flashy Porsche SUV Julian insisted we drive to the club, but the vintage Mercedes SL, a convertible hardtop in silver gray. It was a machine built for endurance, not for show. I threw my bag into the passenger seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life, a deep, throaty growl that vibrated in my chest. I pulled out onto the street, merging into the traffic heading toward the Queensboro Bridge. The rain began to fall in earnest, drumming against the roof, washing away the grime of the city. As I crossed the bridge, leaving the spires of Manhattan behind, I felt the physical sensation of the tether snapping. For years, I had been orbiting Julian, adjusting my gravity to suit his needs, dimming my light so his could shine brighter. I had let him design me. But architects know that structure dictates function. He had built a life on a foundation of sand, assuming the view would distract from the erosion. He didn't realize that I was the bedrock. And without me, the whole thing was just glass waiting to shatter. I drove east, the landscape shifting from concrete to green, the highway opening up. I didn't turn on the radio. I listened to the rain and the engine, the soundtrack of my escape. By the time I reached the Hamptons, the light was fading. The estate sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, hidden behind high hedges of privet. It wasn't a summer house. It was a fortress of gray shingles and white trim, standing stoic against the Atlantic wind. It smelled of salt spray and old wood, of history and permanence. I pulled up to the front steps. The house was dark, but it didn't look abandoned. It looked like it was waiting. I killed the engine. The silence of the country rushed in, punctuated only by the distant roar of the ocean. I checked my watch. Julian would be landing in 20 minutes. I imagined him walking through LAX, phone in hand, anticipating the warm California breeze and the arms of his mistress. I imagined him walking up to the rental counter, flashing that charming, practiced smile, handing over the platinum card that was currently flagged as stolen/compromised. I imagined the clerk's polite confusion. The second attempt. The call to the bank. The automated voice telling him his access was denied. A small, cold smile touched my lips. I grabbed my bag and walked up the steps to the heavy front door. I unlocked it, the mechanism turning with a satisfying, heavy clunk. I stepped inside, into the cool, still air of the foyer. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to. I knew every corner of this house. It was in my blood. I was alone. And for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't waiting for anyone to tell me where to stand. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of wine from the cellar, and sat by the window overlooking the dunes. The storm was rolling in off the ocean, dark and magnificent. Let it rain. I was watertight. The library of the Hamptons estate was the only room in the house that faced north, away from the ocean, staring instead into the dense, tangled woods that bordered the property. It was a masculine room, lined with floor-to-ceiling walnut shelves and smelling of aged paper and leather bindings, a scent that usually comforted me. Tonight, however, the room felt like a cold storage facility for the truth. I sat at the heavy partner's desk, a single banker's lamp casting a pool of green-tinted light onto the leather blotter. Outside, the storm had intensified, the wind thrashing the oak trees, rain lashing against the leaded glass panes like handfuls of gravel. Inside, the only sound was the hum of my laptop and the rhythmic clicking of my mouse. Harrison had been true to his word. At 9:15 p.m., the secure email arrived. Subject: Preliminary Financial Audit/Vance Holdings /discrepancies. Attachment: Vance_forensic_phase 1.xlsx, 45 megabytes. I downloaded the file. 45 megabytes of betrayal. I opened the spreadsheet. To the untrained eye, it would have looked like a chaotic wall of numbers, a migraine-inducing grid of dates, routing numbers, and transaction codes. But I was not untrained. I had been reading balance sheets since I was 12 years old, sitting on my grandfather's knee as he explained the difference between liquidity and solvency. He taught me that numbers were the only language that didn't lie. People lied. Narratives lied. But the ledger always remembered. I took a sip of the scotch I had poured, neat, single malt, older than my marriage, and began to trace the veins of the infection. The summary tab told the story in bold, red font. Total unaccounted outflows, FI 2020 to 2023, $4,200,000. $4.2 million. My stomach didn't drop. It tightened. This wasn't just skimming. This was a hemorrhage. I clicked on the tab labeled Vendor Analysis. Harrison's team had flagged a series of recurring payments to 3 specific entities: Verona Stone Consulting, Pacific Coast Logistics, and Archibald Sourcing. They sounded legitimate. They sounded like the boring, necessary friction of high-end architecture. We imported marble from Verona. We shipped steel from the Pacific. But as I drilled down into the line items, the facade crumbled. I cross-referenced the invoice dates with Julian's calendar, which I had synced to my cloud years ago. Invoice number 4092, Verona Stone Consulting. $45,000. Description: Site inspection, Carrara Quarry. Date: November 14th, 2021. I checked the calendar. November 14th, 2021. Julian was supposedly in Italy, hand-selecting Calacatta gold marble for the penthouse renovation. I remembered that week. I had stayed in New York, attending board meetings for the foundation. I remembered him texting me photos of espresso and ancient cobblestones. I opened the folder of raw data Harrison had included, scans of the actual cash checks and wire transfers. I found the corresponding wire for the Verona invoice. It hadn't gone to an Italian IBAN. It had been routed to a domestic LLC registered in Delaware. I pulled up the Delaware corporate registry on a separate tab. It took me 3 minutes to navigate the layers of obfuscation. Verona Stone Consulting wasn't a marble supplier. The registered agent was a generic legal service, but the signatory on the incorporation documents was familiar. Elena Rossetti. The signature was loopy, girlish. The same hand that used to sign for my packages in the lobby. I felt a cold flash of clarity. There was no marble. There was no Italy. I went back to the spreadsheet, my eyes scanning the columns with predatory focus. I began to map the flow of funds, drawing mental lines from the Vanderbilt Charitable Trust, where Julian sat as a non-voting advisor with signing privileges, to these shell companies. January 2022, $12,000 to Pacific Coast Logistics. February 2022, $12,000 to Pacific Coast Logistics. March 2022, $12,000 to Pacific Coast Logistics. It was a monthly stipend. Alimony in advance. Rent. I opened the bank statements for Pacific Coast Logistics that Harrison had subpoenaed. The debits weren't for shipping containers or cranes. They were debit card transactions. Whole Foods, Malibu. Celine, Rodeo Drive. Dr. Anthony Aris, OBGYN, Santa Monica. I stopped. The cursor hovered over that name. Dr. Aris. I knew that name. He was one of the most expensive obstetricians on the West Coast. He was the doctor the Hollywood wives used when they wanted a C-section that wouldn't leave a scar. I scrolled down. The payments to Dr. Aris escalated in late 2022. Then, a massive lump sum to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Date: August 4th, 2022. Amount: $68,000. The birth. I looked at the date. August 4th. I closed my eyes, and the memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. August 4th. I was in the Hamptons that weekend. Julian had told me he was stuck in the city, dealing with a crisis at the Hudson Yards site. He said a crane had stalled. He said the unions were threatening a walkout. He had sounded so stressed on the phone, so weary. I had told him not to worry, to take care of himself. I had sent him a bottle of wine to the office. He wasn't at Hudson Yards. He was in a delivery room in Los Angeles, watching his mistress give birth to the son he bought with my money. I opened my eyes. The tears I expected didn't come. Instead, a dry, arid heat spread through my chest. It was the heat of absolute, scorching realization. Julian wasn't just a cheater. Adultery is a moral failing. It's a weakness of character. This was something else entirely. This was a felony. He had systematically siphoned over $4 million from a nonprofit organization dedicated to arts education, my family's legacy, to fund a domestic fantasy he couldn't afford on his own salary. He had turned me into a financier for his infidelity. Every diaper, every organic avocado, every cashmere onesie that child wore was paid for by the Vanderbilt Trust. I looked at the screen, the blue light reflecting in the darkened. The storm outside had settled into a relentless, driving rhythm, a gray curtain that separated the estate from the rest of the world. I stood in the library, the phone in my hand feeling like a detonator. It was 1 p.m. on the East Coast, which meant it was 10 a.m. in Santa Monica. Julian would be awake. He would be caffeinated. He would be feeling the invincibility that comes with a sunny Saturday morning and a secret that hasn't yet been discovered. I needed one last confirmation, a final structural stress test before I brought the building down. I dialed his number. He answered on the second ring, his voice smooth, devoid of guilt. Victoria? Is everything all right? I was just about to call you. Everything is fine, I said, leaning against the cold window pane. I just wanted to hear your voice. How is Seattle? Wet, he laughed, a sound that used to charm me but now sounded like static. Relentless rain. I'm currently holed up in the hotel room going over the zoning permits. It's a slog. I miss the city. I miss you too, I lied. The words felt like ash in my mouth. Are you alone? Of course. Just me and a pot of lukewarm coffee. Why? I thought I heard something. There was a pause. A hesitation, so slight only a wife would notice. Then, in the background, distinct and undeniable, came the sound. It wasn't the hum of a hotel HVAC or the traffic of a rainy city. It was a gurgle, a high-pitched, happy coo of a baby. And then, a woman's voice, Elena's voice, muffled but audible. "Leo, look at the bunny. Look at the bunny, sweetie." My hand tightened around the phone until my knuckles turned white. The mistake wasn't just on paper anymore. It was breathing. It was living in a moment of domestic bliss that I had paid for. "Must be the TV," Julian said quickly, his voice pitching up a fraction of an octave. "The walls in this hotel are paper thin." "Right," I said. My voice was ice. "The TV. Get back to work, Julian. Don't let me distract you from your permits." I hung up. I didn't throw the phone. I didn't scream. I simply placed the device gently on the desk, right next to the forensic audit report. The verification was complete. The lie was absolute. I picked up the other phone, the burner I used for the lawyer, and sent a single text to Harrison. "Execute." I sat down in the leather wingback chair and watched the clock. The second hand swept around the face with agonizing precision. Tick, tick, tick. I closed my eyes and let my imagination travel 3,000 miles west. I knew Julian's habits. I knew his Saturday ritual. If they were in Santa Monica, and if Elena was with the baby, they wouldn't be in a hotel. They would be shopping. Julian loved to shop. He loved the performance of purchasing, the way sales associates fawned over the black Centurion card, the way the transaction validated his status. I pictured him at Petit Trésor on Montana Avenue. It was the kind of place where a crib cost more than a Honda Civic. He would be standing there, likely wearing his linen blazer and those Persol sunglasses, looking every inch the proud, wealthy father. He would be selecting something extravagant. A hand-carved mahogany cradle. A cashmere receiving blanket. 1:14 p.m. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was a notification from the American Express app, which I still had mirrored on my device. Transaction alert. Card ending in -8009. Merchant. Petit Trésor, Santa Monica. Amount. $4,850. Status. Declined. A cold, dark satisfaction uncoiled in my chest. I could see it. I could see him handing the card to the salesgirl with that dismissive, arrogant wrist flick. I could see her swipe it. I could see the frown crease her forehead. "I'm sorry, sir. It didn't go through." He would laugh. He would blame the chip. He would tell her to run it again. Buzz. Status. Declined. Fraud alert. He would be flushing now. A slow, creeping red staining his neck. He would be patting his pockets, reaching for the backup, the Visa signature linked to the joint checking account. The one we used for household expenses. Buzz. Transaction alert. Visa ending in -4,420. Status. Declined. Insufficient funds. I took a sip of my water. The water was cold. Perfect. He was standing in a boutique full of affluent mothers and judgmental staff, unable to buy a crib for his illegitimate son. The illusion of his power was evaporating in real time. He was no longer Julian Thorne, the visionary architect. He was just a man with a declined card and a lie he couldn't finance. My phone rang. It was Harrison. "It's done," he said, his voice graveled and efficient. "The assets are frozen. The credit lines are severed. The bank has flagged all activity as potential embezzlement pending the internal audit of the foundation." "And the reaction?" I asked. "He just called the firm. He was trying to reach his personal banker, but we had the calls rerouted to my office. He was spirited." "Tell me." "He demanded to know why his cards were declining. He tried to authorize a manual override. I informed him that due to irregularities discovered in the Vanderbilt trust accounts, specifically regarding unauthorized transfers to Pacific Coast Logistics, an immediate injunction has been placed on all associated assets." I leaned back, closing my eyes, savoring the words. "Did he try to explain?" He stuttered. "He tried to claim it was a clerical error. He demanded to speak to you." I told him that you were unavailable and that, effectively immediately, I am his sole point of contact regarding the audit. And his employment? I informed him that he is suspended from the firm, pending the investigation. His access to the corporate servers has been revoked. His key card is deactivated. And as of 10 minutes ago, the locks on the Upper East Side penthouse have been digitally rekeyed. He's homeless, I whispered. He's in a legal vacuum, Victoria. He has no access to funds, no access to his marital home, and no access to the company. He is, for all intents and purposes, liquidated.
Good.
He's going to try to come back, Harrison warned. He's going to get on the first flight he can talk his way onto. Let him come, I said, opening my eyes and looking at the storm raging outside. The trees were bending, but the house, my house, stood firm. He can't fly first class with a declined card. He'll have to sit in coach. It will give him 6 hours to think about the difference between a wife and a venture capitalist. I'll prepare the papers for his arrival. Stay in the Hamptons, Victoria. Let the distance do the work. I'm not going anywhere, Harrison. I'm just enjoying the quiet. I hung up the phone. The silence in the library was profound. It wasn't the empty, heavy silence of the dust motes in the penthouse. It was the clean, sharp silence of a slate being wiped clean. I looked at the audit report one last time. The numbers were just ink on paper now. They had served their purpose. I stood up and walked to the fireplace, where a small fire was dying in the grate. I didn't throw the papers in. That would be dramatic. Instead, I walked to the window and watched the rain wash the world clean. Julian was currently standing on a sidewalk in Santa Monica, humiliated, broke, and exposed. He was holding a baby he couldn't afford and looking at a woman who was about to realize her golden goose was actually just a common thief. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the scent of old paper and rain. The demolition was underway. Now, I just had to wait for the dust to settle. The dawn did not break over the Hamptons. It unveiled itself, a slow, gray reveal of the Atlantic Ocean churning against the dunes. The light was cold, harsh, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. I stood on the terrace, wrapped in a cashmere throw, watching the sea foam bruise the sand. My phone sat on the teak table behind me, vibrating against the wood. It had been vibrating for 45 minutes.
Julian.
He was persistent.
I would give him that.
It was the persistence of a drowning man clawing at the hull of the boat that had left him behind. I finished my espresso, the ceramic warm against my fingertips, and finally turned to the device. I didn't pick up immediately. I watched the screen light up with his name, a name that used to make my heart flutter, but now looked like a typo in a legal brief. I swiped right. Victoria. His voice was a jagged tear in the morning silence. It was high, breathless, stripped of its usual baritone composure. Victoria, for God's sake, pick up. Do you have any idea what's happening? My cards are dead. The hotel is threatening to call the police. I'm stuck in the lobby with the luggage. He stopped himself. He didn't say with Elena and the baby. He still thought he could curate the frame. I know, Julian, I said. My voice was low, resonant with the calm of someone who holds the deed. I authorized the freeze.
You what?
You can't do that. That's my money. That's our money. This is insane. I'm coming home right now, and we're going to fix this. There is nothing to fix, I said, walking back into the library where the air was still heavy with the scent of old paper and the previous night's revelation. A structure that is condemned cannot be fixed. It has to be raised. What are you talking about? Stop speaking in riddles. I am your husband. No, I corrected him, gentle and lethal. You were an investment, and a poor one at that. Victoria. Listen to me very carefully, Julian. You seem to be laboring under the delusion that you were a partner in this marriage, or in this family. You were never a partner. You were a tenant. You occupied a space I paid for. You built a reputation on a foundation I poured. And like any tenant who violates the lease, who damages the property and brings in unauthorized occupants, your term has expired. Unauthorized occupants. His breath hitched. The silence on the line was deafening. He knew. I saw the policy, Julian. I saw the photos. I saw the receipts for the nursery in Malibu. The eviction notice has been served. Don't come to the penthouse. The locks have been changed. Don't come here. Security has your photograph. You are currently a liability I am in the process of liquidating. You can't do this, he whispered, his voice cracking, the arrogance dissolving into pure terror. I'm Julian Thorne. I built this city. You built nothing, I said. You just spent my money. I tapped the red icon. The connection severed. The silence rushed back in, cleaner than before. I stood there for a moment, feeling the adrenaline hum in my veins. Not the chaotic rush of anger, but the cold, steady current of power. I had stripped him of his financing. I had stripped him of his home. But he still had his name. He still had his reputation as the visionary architect of the skyline. And then the computer chimed. It wasn't a text. It was an email. A single notification sliding onto the screen of my laptop, which was still open to the forensic audit. From unknown sender, encrypted protonmail. Subject: The origin of the Thorne Tower. Attachment: Finch_archive_2008 PDF. I frowned. The timing was too precise. It felt like the universe was piling on, or perhaps like I wasn't the only one waiting for Julian Thorne to bleed. I sat down at the desk. The name Finch tugged at a loose thread in my memory. Alastair Finch. I remembered him from Julian's stories about graduate school at Yale. Julian had described him as a tragedy, a brilliant but unstable burnout, a drug addict who had washed out of the program and disappeared into obscurity. A waste of talent, Julian had said, shaking his head with performative pity. I opened the attachment. It was a scan of a large format document. The paper was yellowed, the edges frayed, but the lines were sharp. It was an architectural elevation. Hand-drawn in ink, not CAD. My eyes widened. I knew this building. Everyone in New York knew this building. It was the Thorne Tower, Julian's breakout project, the twisting glass spire on West 57th Street that had won him the Pritzker nomination and cemented his status as a genius. But the date in the corner wasn't 2015, the year Julian unveiled the design. Date: May 12, 2008. Project: The Helix Vertical. Architect: Alastair Finch. I scrolled down. There were notes in the margins, detailed calculations regarding the wind load on the torsion structure, specific references to the sustainable glass skin that Julian claimed to have invented. I opened the next file. It was a letter, handwritten, addressed to the Dean of Architecture at Yale. I am formally contesting the expulsion. My thesis materials were missing from the studio 2 days before the review. I did not lose them. They were removed. I suspect Julian Vance has. The letter cut off. Unfinished. Or perhaps never sent. I sat back, the leather chair groaning softly. The room felt suddenly cold, despite the heating. Julian hadn't just embezzled money. He hadn't just plagiarized a term paper. He had stolen a man's life. He had taken Alastair Finch's genius, waited for the man to succumb to the demons Julian likely helped feed, and then claimed the work as his own. The Thorne Tower, the building that defined his career, the vision that convinced my father he was worthy of the Vanderbilt name, it was all a forgery. Julian was a fraud. A total, holistic fraud. There wasn't a single authentic bone in his body. His money was mine. His family was secret. His genius belonged to a ghost. I looked at the blueprints again. The beauty of the lines was undeniable, but now I saw the tragedy in them. They were drawn by a man who loved the sky, stolen by a man who only loved the mirror. This was the kill shot. Taking his money would hurt him. Exposing his infidelity would embarrass him. But this would erase him. In the world of high architecture, plagiarism is the only sin for which there is no absolution. It is a death sentence. I reached for the phone again. Not to call Julian. He was irrelevant now. I dialed Harrison. I have a new objective, I said when he answered, my voice steady, devoid of the tremor that shook my hands. Go ahead, Victoria. We aren't just filing for divorce. We are filing a formal complaint with the American Institute of Architects. And I need you to find a man named Alistair Finch. Or his estate. On what grounds? Intellectual property theft.
Fraud.
I have the proofs, Harrison. The Thorn Tower isn't a thorn. It's a stolen concept. I heard Harrison inhale sharply. Victoria, if we release this, the firm will implode. His license will be revoked. The lawsuits from the developers alone will bankrupt him for 3 lifetimes. I know, I said. I looked out the window at the gray ocean, relentless and ancient. He wanted a legacy, Harrison. I'm going to give him one. He's going to be the man who fell from the tallest height. Send me the file. I forwarded the email. As the progress bar filled, I felt a strange sense of peace. The man I married was gone. In fact, he had never existed. I had married a reflection, a mirage projected onto a screen of ambition. I closed the laptop. The dawn had fully broken now, the sun piercing through the clouds, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the library air. They didn't look like debris anymore. They looked like ashes. I stood up and walked out of the library, leaving the ghost of Alistair Finch to haunt the machine. I had work to do. I had to dress for the day. I had to look perfect. Because when the tower fell, I intended to be the only one left standing among the ruins. The phone rang again. It wasn't the frantic, vibrating plea of my husband this time. It was a slow, steady trill from an unknown number. I watched it for a moment, the screen glowing against the overcast light of the library. My intuition, sharpened by 48 hours of systematic dismantling, told me this wasn't a creditor or a reporter. I picked it up. This is Victoria. Ms. Vanderbilt. The voice was raspy, like dry leaves skittering over pavement. It sounded exhausted, yet possessed of a strange, brittle clarity. I assume you've read the PDF.
I didn't ask who it was.
I knew. I have, Mr. Finch. Please call me Alistair. Mr. Finch was my father, and he died of shame 10 years ago when his son was blacklisted from every firm on the eastern seaboard. I sat down in the leather chair, my spine rigid. Why now, Alistair? You've been silent for 15 years. You let him build a kingdom on your foundation. You let him take the Pritzker nomination. I was waiting, he said simply. Julian is a parasite. Parasites are careful at first. They only take what they need to survive. But eventually they get greedy. They consume the host. I knew he would slip. I knew he would try to build something he didn't understand, and the structural integrity would fail. He paused, and I heard the flick of a lighter and the inhale of a cigarette. I've been watching the accounts, Victoria. I have a friend in the permit office in Malibu. My grip on the phone tightened. You know about the house. The azure shell? He laughed, a dry, coughing sound. That's what he calls it? God. He's derivative. The project was originally titled Coastal Erosion and Resilience. It was my final project at Yale. He stole the hard drives from my dorm room the night before the review. The air left the room. It wasn't just the tower. It was everything. The sanctuary where Julian was playing house with his mistress, the sustainable masterpiece he claimed to be designing for the future of the West Coast, it was all stolen. He was raising his illegitimate child inside a plagiarism. He's never had an original thought in his life, has he? I asked, the realization settling over me like a shroud. He's a draftsman, Victoria. A very good draftsman with a very expensive smile. But he's not an architect. He doesn't understand the soul of a building. He only understands the facade. I have the forensic audit, I said, my voice turning to business. I have the proof of the embezzlement. But financial crimes can be settled. They can be paid off. Reputation is different. If I expose the plagiarism, he won't just be broke. He will be erased. I can send you the original C80 files, Alistair said. The metadata doesn't lie. Created May 2008. Author, A. Finch. It matches the Malibu construction documents line for line. The cantilever deck? That's mine. The solar orientation? Mine. Even the nursery layout. I designed that for a theoretical client. Send it. I commanded. Send everything. I want my name back, Victoria. That's my price. You'll have more than your name, Alistair. You'll have the firm. I hung up. The email arrived 10 seconds later. I opened the files. It was undeniable. The digital fingerprints were all over the blueprints. Julian hadn't designed a single beam of his life. He was a hollow man, a shell company in human form. I stood up. The Hamptons house felt too small now. The quiet, salt-air isolation that had served as my bunker was no longer necessary. I didn't need to hide. I needed to hunt. I packed my laptop, the hard drive, and the original deed to the Southampton property into my bag. I walked out to the Mercedes, ignoring the rain that was beginning to spot the silk of my blouse. I threw the bag into the passenger seat and keyed the engine. As I tore down the gravel driveway, leaving the gray Atlantic behind, I dialed Harrison. "Sterling," he answered, the single word clipped and ready. "I'm coming back to the city," I said, merging onto the Montauk Highway. The tires hissed against the wet asphalt. "I need you to locate Alistair Finch, the ghost. He's real. And he has the smoking gun. He's likely in the city, probably in a walk-up in the East Village or Bushwick. Check the IP address from the email I forwarded you. I don't care if you have to hire a private investigator or bribe a landlord. Find him. And when I find him, clean him up. Get him a barber. Get him a tailor. Buy him a suit from the bespoke rack at Bergdorf's, something charcoal, authoritative. I want him looking like the partner he should have been, not the victim he was." "What's the play, Victoria?" "We're holding a board meeting. Tonight. 8 p.m. at the penthouse." "Tonight? It's Sunday. The board members are scattered." "They'll come," I interrupted, cutting across 3 lanes of traffic to hit the expressway. "Call the chairman. Tell him I am invoking Article 4 of the bylaws, immediate danger to the firm's reputation and solvency. Tell him I have discovered a liability so catastrophic it requires immediate containment. Tell him if he doesn't attend, he'll be reading about the dissolution of Vance and Thorne in the Wall Street Journal tomorrow morning." "Understood. And Julian? Is he still in California?" "He's at the airport. He managed to get a friend to pay for a coach ticket. He lands at JFK at 7:30 p.m. I smiled. It was perfect. The timing was architectural in its precision. Let him land. Let him come to the penthouse. He thinks he's coming to beg for his marriage. He thinks he can charm his way back into the foyer. He doesn't know about Finch. He thinks Finch is a dead memory. He thinks he's safe." I pressed the accelerator. The speedometer climbed past 80. The landscape blurred, green trees giving way to the industrial gray of Queens, the skyline of Manhattan rising in the distance like a jagged crown of glass and steel. I saw the Thorne Tower piercing the clouds on 57th Street. It twisted elegantly as it rose, a helix of light and ambition. It was beautiful.
And it was a lie.
"Harrison," I said, my eyes fixed on that stolen spire. "Draft a new partnership agreement. Remove Julian Vance. Insert Alistair Finch. And prepare a press release. Headline: Fraud." I hung up and threw the phone onto the passenger seat. The drive into the city usually took 2 hours. I made it in 90 minutes. The rain had stopped by the time I crossed the bridge, leaving the city scrubbed clean and glistening. The streets were slick with oil and water, reflecting the brake lights of a million cars. I wasn't just a wife anymore. I wasn't just an heiress protecting her trust fund. I was the silent partner who had finally decided to speak. I pulled up to the service entrance of the building. The doorman rushed out, umbrella in hand, but I waved him off. I didn't need protection from the elements. I was the storm. I took the private elevator to the penthouse. The doors slid open to the silence I had left behind 2 days ago. The dust motes were gone, settled by the stagnant air. The orchids were dead. I walked to the center of the living room. I moved the coffee table. I arranged the chairs in a semicircle facing the door. I went to the bar and poured 2 glasses of scotch. One for me, one for Alistair. I checked my watch. 6:45 p.m. The board would be here in an hour. Alistair would be here in 40 minutes. And Julian. Julian was currently squeezed into a middle seat in economy, hurtling through the sky toward the ground zero of his own making. I took a sip of the scotch. It burned, a clean, smoky fire that settled in my chest. "Welcome home, darling," I whispered to the empty room. I sat down to wait for the demolition to begin. The city didn't welcome me back. It acknowledged my return. The Mercedes sliced through the Midtown Tunnel, the amber lights blurring into streaks of gold against the tiled walls. I emerged onto 34th Street, the tires humming on the wet asphalt, the air smelling of ozone and exhaust, the perfume of ambition. I turned onto Park Avenue, and there he was. A 60-foot billboard plastered against the side of a pre-war scaffolding. It was a black and white portrait of Julian, shot by Leibovitz, looking pensive and visionary. He was holding a roll of blueprints, staring off into the middle distance, as if seeing a world the rest of us were too pedestrian to comprehend. Julian Vance, designing the future. I laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that startled me. It wasn't a laugh of hysteria. It was a laugh of genuine, dark amusement. He wasn't designing the future. He was plagiarizing the past. He was a curator of other men's brilliance, posing as a creator. I drove past him, leaving his giant, fraudulent face behind in the rain. When the private elevator opened into the penthouse, the atmosphere was different. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was expectant. Mrs. Higgins, my housekeeper for the last decade, was standing in the foyer, her hands clasped nervously over her apron. She knew. Staff always knows. They read the energy of a house long before the divorce papers are filed. "Mrs. Thorne," she began, her voice tentative. "Ms. Vanderbilt," I corrected gently, pulling off my leather driving gloves. "And we have work to do, Mrs. Higgins. I need boxes. Heavy-duty archiving crates. For the seasonal wardrobe? For everything," I said, walking past her into the living room. "I want Mr. Vance's closet emptied. Every suit, every watch, every single cashmere sweater. I want his toiletries cleared from the master bath. I want his espresso machine removed from the kitchen counter. If it belongs to him, I want it out of sight. Shall we dispose of it?" "No," I said, checking my reflection in the hallway mirror. I looked pale but sharp, like a blade freshly whetted. "That would be destruction of property. We're going to store it. Send it to the basement facility in Queens. The one with the dam problem. Label it miscellaneous liability." "Yes, Ms. Vanderbilt." She straightened, sensing the shift in command. "And there's a gentleman waiting in the library. Mr. Sterling sent him." I walked to the library doors. They were closed. I took a breath, smoothing the lapel of my trench coat, and pushed them open. Alistair Finch was standing by the window, looking out at the city that had forgotten him. Harrison had done his work well. The man who turned to face me wasn't the broken addict Julian had described, nor the ghost I had imagined. He was clean-shaven, his hair trimmed into a severe, respectable cut. He was wearing a charcoal wool suit that fit him perfectly, likely pulled from the archives of a bespoke tailor Harrison kept on retainer. But the eyes were the same. They were the eyes of the man who had drawn the Thorne Tower. Intelligent, haunted, and currently burning with a cold, blue fire. "It's a good view," Alistair said, his voice rougher than the silk suit suggested. He always did like to look down on things. "It's easier to ignore the cracks in the foundation from this height," I replied, walking over to the desk. "Thank you for coming, Alistair." He looked at me, assessing the woman who had lived with his enemy for 7 years. "I didn't come for you, Victoria. I came for the autopsy." "Fair enough." I opened my laptop and connected it to the large monitor mounted on the wall. "The board arrives in 2 hours. Julian arrives in 1. We need to be surgical." For the next 90 minutes, the library became a war room. We weren't lovers and we weren't friends. We were co-counsel in a prosecution against a man who had stolen from us both. Alistair moved with a nervous, kinetic energy. He paced the room, chain-smoking despite my no-smoking rule. I allowed it, just this once, as he walked me through the C80 files. Here, he pointed to the screen, where the wireframe of the Malibu house was overlaid with his 2008 thesis project. "Look at the load-bearing walls in the nursery. See the angle? 32 degrees. It's inefficient for the California sun, but I did it because I wanted the shadow to hit the crib at exactly 4 p.m. A poetic flourish. And Julian kept it? He kept it because he didn't know how to change it without collapsing the roof, Alistair sneered. He copied the math because he didn't understand the physics. I typed quickly, adding the annotation to the presentation deck. Exhibit C, this structural plagiarism. We worked in a rhythm. I handled the financials. He handled the architecture. I pulled up the flow of funds, the $4.2 million siphon from the trust, and mapped it directly to the construction timeline of the stolen design. It's a closed loop, I murmured, staring at the screen. He used my family's money to build your stolen house for his secret family. It's almost impressive in its sociopathy. It's not sociopathy, Alistair said, pouring himself a glass of water, his hand shaking slightly. It's emptiness. Julian is a mirror. He reflects whatever is in front of him. He reflected your wealth. He reflected my talent. Take those away, and there is nothing left. Just a man in a rented suit. I looked at Alistair. I saw the years of lost time in the lines around his mouth, the career that never happened because Julian had crushed him to climb higher. We're going to give you your name back tonight, I promised. I don't just want the name, he said softly. I want the tower. I want my name on the building on 57th Street. You'll have it. I own the controlling interest in the land lease. I'll rename it the Finch Vertical by tomorrow morning. The elevator dinged in the hallway. I froze. It was too early for the board. I checked the security feed on my phone. It was Julian. He was early. He must have sprinted through the terminal. He was standing in the elevator car, looking disheveled. His tie was loosened, his hair windblown, his face flushed with the panic of a man who has been pressing buttons that no longer work. He's here, I said, my voice calm. Alistair stiffened. Do you want me to hide? No, I said, standing up and smoothing my skirt. I walked over to the desk and closed the laptop, leaving the black screen reflecting the room. I want you to sit in his chair. Alistair looked at the massive leather executive chair behind the partner's desk, Julian's throne. A slow, wolfish smile spread across his face. With pleasure. I'll go greet him, I said, walking toward the door. Stay here. Don't speak until I open the doors. Let him see you. I walked out into the foyer just as the elevator door slid open. Julian stepped out. He looked like a wreck. He was carrying his own bag, a shocking sight in itself. His suit was rumpled from the economy seat. He smelled of stale airplane air and desperation. He saw me standing there, backlit by the city lights, dressed in black silk, wearing the Vanderbilt pearls. Victoria, he breathed, dropping the bag on the marble floor. He took a step toward me, his hands reaching out, his face contorting into that familiar mask of practiced charm, though the cracks were visible now. Baby, thank God. This has been a nightmare. The banks, the cards. Tell me it's just a misunderstanding. Tell me we can fix this. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I looked at him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen in a jar. Hello, Julian, I said. You're early. The board isn't here yet. The board? He stopped, blinking. What board? Victoria, I'm talking about us. I'm talking about our marriage. We don't have a marriage, I said, turning on my heel. We have a pending litigation.
Come with me.
There's someone waiting for you in the library.
Who?
Harrison. He followed me, stumbling slightly, his confusion radiating off him in waves. Victoria, stop this coldness. It's me. It's Julian. I walked to the library doors. I placed my hands on the heavy oak handles, the doors he had closed in my face so many times to take his private calls. No, I said, pushing the doors open to reveal the room. You aren't Julian Vance, the architect. You're just a tenant whose lease is up. I stepped aside. Julian walked in. He looked toward the desk. He saw the man sitting in his chair. He saw the face he thought he had buried 15 years ago. Hello, Julian, Alistair said, his voice echoing in the silence. I believe you have my pencils. Julian's face went white. Not pale, white. The blood drained from him, So instantly, it looked like a physical blow. He staggered back, clutching the doorframe. I stood behind him, watching the collapse. The scorned wife was gone. The corporate executioner had clocked in. "Sit down, Julian," I said, closing the doors behind us, sealing the three of us inside the room where the truth was waiting. "We have a presentation to review." The grand salon was designed for acoustics. The vaulted ceilings, the silk-paneled walls, the heavy velvet drapery, it was all engineered to amplify the sound of a string quartet or a polite toast. Tonight, however, it amplified the silence. 6 men sat in the semicircle of wingback chairs I had arranged. They were the board of directors for Vance and Thorne, men who controlled endowments, museum commissions, and the skylines of 3 continents. They held tumblers of scotch, but no one was drinking. They were waiting. I stood by the fireplace, the marble mantle cool beneath my hand. Alistair stood to my right, a silent, charcoal-clad specter. The double doors opened. Julian walked in. He had tried to fix himself in the hallway. He had tightened his tie and smoothed his windblown hair, attempting to reconstruct the facade of the golden boy. But the cracks were visible. His eyes were darting, his skin was the color of old parchment, and the confident stride that usually commanded a room was reduced to a hesitant shuffle. He looked at the board.
He looked at me.
And then, his eyes dragged back to Alistair, the ghost he had seen in the library, now standing beside me like a co-prosecutor. "Gentlemen," Julian said. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again, forcing the baritone. "Gentlemen." I wasn't aware we had a quarterly review scheduled. "My wife seems to have a flair for the dramatic tonight." He tried to smile. It was a ghastly thing, a grimace that didn't reach his eyes. The chairman, Arthur Penn, a man who had known my grandfather and possessed the warmth of a glacier, did not smile back. He set his glass down on the coaster with a sharp clink. "This isn't a review, Julian," Arthur said. "It's an audit." "An audit?" Julian laughed, a nervous, jagged sound. "I assure you, the firm's finances are impeccable. We just landed the Seattle contract." "Sit down, Julian," I said. My voice was soft, but it carried across the room with the weight of a gavel. He looked at me with pure venom, but he sat. He took the single stiff-backed chair facing the board, looking for all the world like a criminal in the dock. I picked up the remote for the projector screen I had lowered over the fireplace. "Slide 1, I said. The screen illuminated. A spreadsheet appeared. It was the flow of funds from the Vanderbilt Charitable Trust to the shell companies. "Over the last 3 years," I began, my tone conversational, as if discussing the weather, "Julian has transferred $4.2 million from the foundation into 3 entities: Verona Stone, Pacific Coast Logistics, and Archibald Sourcing. None of these companies exist. They're funnels." "Victoria, please," Julian hissed, gripping the arms of his chair. "This is a misunderstanding. These are consulting fees for sensitive acquisitions. You don't understand the complexities of—" "Slide 2, I interrupted. The screen changed. It showed the bank statements of the shell companies, the debit charges, the OBGYN bills, the preschool tuition, the rent for the Malibu estate. "The complexities appear to be domestic," I said.
Diapers. Formula.
A leased Range Rover in Santa Monica, and a monthly allowance for a woman named Elena Rossetti. The board members shifted. A murmur of distaste rippled through the room. Adultery was common in their world. Getting caught paying for it with a company dime was unforgivable. "You're hysterical," Julian spat, abandoning the charm. "You're spinning this. I'm the creative visionary of this firm. My personal life is irrelevant to the bottom line." "If only it were personal," I said. "But you didn't just steal the money, Julian. You stole the brand." I looked at Alistair. He stepped forward. He didn't look like a victim anymore. He looked like the architect he was born to be. "Slide 3, I said. The screen changed again. On the left, the iconic elevation of the Thorne Tower, the twisting glass spire that had won Julian the Pritzker nomination. On the right, a yellowed, hand-drawn blueprint dated 2008. Project, the Helix Vertical. Architect, Alistair Finch. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a reputation disintegrating. Arthur Penn stood up. He walked over to the screen, putting on his reading glasses. He looked at the date. He looked at the signature. He looked at Julian. "You stole it?" Arthur asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The tower? The flagship? It's a lie!" Julian shouted, jumping to his feet. "Finch was a junkie. He washed out. He's hallucinating. I designed that tower on a napkin at the Four Seasons." "You designed nothing," Alistair said. His voice was calm, raspy, and terrifyingly steady. "You stole my hard drive from the dorms. You stole my thesis. You stole my life. And you didn't even build it right. You compromised the wind shear coefficients to save money on the steel." Julian looked around the room, wild-eyed. He saw the faces of the men who had championed him, who had invited him to their clubs, who had invested in his genius. They weren't looking at him with anger. They were looking at him with disgust. "This is a setup," Julian snarled, turning on me. "You planned this. You vindictive, cold-hearted bitch. You couldn't keep me, so you decided to destroy me." "I didn't destroy you, Julian," I said, pouring myself a glass of water. "I just turned on the lights." "It's about the baby, isn't it?" He sneered, taking a step toward me. The desperation was making him cruel. "You're jealous. You couldn't give me a son. You couldn't give me anything but your cold money and your frozen womb. Elena gave me a legacy." The room went deadly still. The insult hung in the air, gross and jagged. A lesser woman would have slapped him. A lesser woman would have cried. I took a sip of water. I looked him up and down, noting the sweat staining his collar, the trembling of his hands. "Elena," I said quietly, tasting the name.
Yes.
"About her." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. "Harrison spoke to her an hour ago. When your credit cards declined at the boutique, she got curious. She called the bank. Then she called the firm." Harrison explained the situation to her. He explained that the house is being foreclosed on. He explained that the trust fund for Leo was actually stolen charity money that is now subject to federal clawback. Julian's face went slack.
"What?"
"She left, Julian. She packed the Range Rover, which I'll be repossessing on Tuesday, and she went to her mother's in Sacramento. She told Harrison to tell you that she doesn't date men with pending indictments." "No," he whispered. "She loves me." "She loved the lifestyle," I corrected. "Love doesn't pay for diapers. And neither do you. Not anymore." I turned to Arthur Penn, chairman. "I move that we invoke the morality clause of the partnership agreement. Immediate termination for cause, forfeiture of all equity, and a public statement dissociating the firm from Mr. Vance to mitigate the plagiarism fallout." "Seconded," Arthur said immediately. "All in favor?" 6 hands went up. "You're fired, Julian," Arthur said. "Give Victoria your keycard. And your phone. It's company property." Julian stood there, swaying slightly. He looked at the board. He looked at Alistair, who was watching him with a look of pity, not hate. And then he looked at me. He expected to see triumph. He expected to see a woman scorned, relishing the kill. But I gave him nothing. My face was a mask of stoic elegance. I felt no joy, no anger. Just the satisfaction of a ledger finally balanced. "My phone," he stammered. "But my contacts. My photos." "The photos of the stolen house?" I asked. "We have copies. Hand it over." He reached into his pocket. His hand shook violently as he placed the phone on the coffee table. Then the keycard. "Get out," I said. "Where am I supposed to go?" he asked, his voice small, broken. "I can't go to the penthouse. I can't go to Malibu. I have no money." "You're an architect, aren't you?" I gestured vaguely to the door. "Go build something. Start with a life that belongs to you." He looked at me one last time, searching for a trace of the wife who used to wait up for him, who used to believe his lies. She wasn't there. He turned and walked out. The heavy oak doors closed behind him with a final, resonant thud. The silence returned to the room. But it wasn't empty. It was clean. I turned to Alistair and raised my glass. To the Finch vertical, I said. Alistair smiled, a real smile this time. To the architect. No, I said, looking at the closed doors. To the demolition. The heavy oak door clicked shut, the sound resonating through the penthouse like the final gavel in a sentencing hearing. The vibration traveled up through the soles of my feet, settling into the marble floor. It was done. The board members had filed out quietly, shaking my hand with the deferential solemnity usually reserved for funerals, though we all knew this was a resurrection. Alistair was the last to leave. He didn't say thank you. He simply nodded, touched the pocket of his new charcoal suit where the partnership agreement now rested, and stepped into the elevator. I was alone. I stood in the center of the grand salon for a long time, listening to the hum of the city 40 stories below. The room felt larger. The air, previously thick with the tension of unsaid things and the heavy scent of Julian's sandalwood cologne, began to cycle out, replaced by the cool, sterile smell of the rain-washed terrace. I walked to the window. Down on the street, the world continued, indifferent to the collapse of a dynasty. I imagined Julian down there. He wouldn't be stepping into the back of a black Escalade with heated seats and a driver named Thomas. He would be standing on the curb, the rain soaking through his rumpled suit, realizing that the Uber app on his phone was linked to a card that no longer existed. He would have to walk. He would have to drag his carry-on bag, the one containing the debris of his stolen life, through the puddles, past the luxury storefronts where he could no longer shop, toward the subway. He was heading to Port Authority. The irony was architectural in its perfection. The man who designed glass spires for the gods was going to sit on a plastic bench in a bus terminal, surrounded by the fluorescent glare of mediocrity, waiting for a greyhound to take him to a place where no one knew his name. He had expected a private jet. He got a ticket to oblivion. I turned away from the window. I didn't need to watch him fade. I had already amortized his value down to zero. I walked to the mantel, where a single object remained. It was a silver-framed photograph of us in Lake Como, taken on the balcony of the Villa d'Este during our honeymoon. We looked golden. I was wearing a white sundress, laughing at something he had whispered. He was looking at me with that intense, focused gaze I had mistaken for love. Now I saw it for what it was, assessment. He wasn't looking at a wife, he was looking at an acquisition. He was calculating the ROI of my smile. I picked up the frame. It was heavy, solid sterling silver. The weight of it felt absurd now, a monument to a fraud. I turned to the fireplace. The flames were low, licking at the birch logs with lazy orange tongues. I didn't throw the frame. That would have been impulsive. Instead, I slid the backing open with a calm, precise fingernail. I removed the photograph. The paper was glossy, high quality. It held the image of our happiness with a stubborn persistence. I crouched down, the silk of my dress pooling around me like dark water. I held the corner of the photograph to the flame. It didn't burn instantly. It bubbled first, the emulsion blistering as the heat attacked the lye. Then, the corner caught. A blue-green flame curled up the edge, consuming the lake, then the villa, then Julian's face. I watched him distort and blacken, his handsome features melting into ash. I watched myself burn last, my white dress turning into gray flake, until the heat reached my fingertips, and I let go. The paper fluttered into the grate, a curled, black skeleton of a memory. Asset liquidated, I whispered. I stood up and brushed a speck of ash from my skirt. I walked over to the bar, but I didn't pour a drink. I didn't need the alcohol to numb anything. The pain was there, certainly. The U-curve of grief, as my therapist would call it, was inevitable. You cannot excise 7 years of your life without leaving a scar. The words he had thrown at me in his final desperation, barren, cold, they had landed. They had drawn blood. But scars are just dermal fortification. They are proof that the structure held under pressure. I wasn't barren. I was fallow. I had been waiting for the right season, the right conditions, to grow something that was actually mine. Julian had tried to plant weeds in my garden and call them roses. Now that he was gone, I could cultivate something else. Not a family, perhaps. Not in the traditional sense. But a legacy. I looked around the penthouse. It was mine. The deed was in the safe. The trust was secured. The firm was under new management. The silence that filled the room wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of sovereignty. I walked to the corner of the room, past the empty space where his Eames chair used to sit, toward the Steinway grand piano. It had been closed for years. Julian had said my playing distracted him when he was working. He claimed the music interfered with his creative process. I had closed the lid, locking away another part of myself to accommodate his ego. I ran my hand along the black lacquer, cool and smooth as obsidian. I lifted the lid. The keys gleamed under the recessed lighting, a perfect row of ivory and ebony teeth waiting to speak. I sat down on the bench. My posture adjusted automatically, spine straight, shoulders back, the physical memory of 1,000 lessons flooding back into my muscles. I didn't play a concerto. I didn't play a nocturne. I didn't need a melody to fill the space. I placed my right hand over the keys, hovering over middle C. I pressed down.
Dong.
The note rang out, clear and resonant. It filled the cavernous room, bouncing off the marble floors, the silk walls, the glass windows. It was a pure, unadulterated sound. It held no apology. It held no hesitation. It was a declaration of existence. I held the key down, letting the hammer strike the string, letting the vibration sustain until it faded into the very corners of the room. I listened to the decay of the sound, watching the dust motes, my dust motes, dance in the stillness. I wasn't waiting for text. I wasn't waiting for a husband to come home and lie to me. I wasn't waiting for permission to exist. I was the owner. I was the architect. And for the first time in 7 years, the composition was entirely up to me. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath of the cool, ash-tinged air, and let the silence wash over me. It was the most expensive, luxurious thing I owned. And I had earned every second of it.